Indonesia has made significant progress on the economic front with improvements to business environment, I should say, and also infrastructure. Yet the US ambassador recently said the country is foregoing billions of dollars from American companies and must do more to encourage trade and foreign investment. So let's bring in our chief international correspondent for Southeast Asia, Haslinda, for a talk about this. And just how open is Indonesia to foreign investment?
Well, really, Heidi, it depends who you speak to. If you speak to the president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, he'll say that, of course, the country is open for business. But the ambassador has a point. There's been flip-flopping of policies, and that is the issue here. Let's get Tom Lembong this morning to give his perspective on it. We heard from the ambassador. There are grounds for him to say that.
Yeah, I think there are grounds for him to say that. Like many developing countries, Indonesia is also held hostage by many entrenched vested interests, many of whom are often corrupt, right? But I believe those vested interests are gradually crumbling, not just because of our reformist policies, but also because of globalization and technology. So these corrupt vested interests that are holding up progress or blocking international investment, their children are now being bullied on social media, right? Their reputations go viral in a negative way on social media. So I believe, broadly speaking, the trends are in favor of reform and opening up and internationalization.
But what would that reform entail? What measures can be implemented to reverse what's happening now?
You'd be surprised, on the World Bank's famous Ease of Doing Business Index, we've improved a lot from ranking number 100.
But Tom, that's not enough. I know it jumped 19 notches, but that's not enough.
Well, we've in fact, over the last 4 years, we've jumped 14 notches, 40 positions, but we're still at merely number 72. So there's still a lot of room for improvement. And look, investors are looking for practical solutions, right? Not kind of flowery, rainbow in the clouds type of stuff. So as President Jokowi likes to say, there's no shortcut, there's no magic bullet. You just have to do it, one by one, step by step. Customs procedures, import-export procedures, operating permits and licenses. One source of corruption is requirements or standards being turned into permits. Right. Now, a simple thing is to turn those permits back into merely requirements, right, to be obeyed rather than a permit that you have to get from some bureaucrat up front.
I'm wondering, Tom, how quickly will these measures be implemented? Because we have, 1.5 years to the end of Jokowi's term?
So, Haslinda, you might remember last year I became increasingly vocal with you as well that I felt we were losing reform momentum, right? Well, I'm happy to report that as of January 5, which was the second cabinet meeting of the year, I'm enjoying a renewed optimism. I think President Jokowi's mind and concentration has returned full force to the economic policy reform agenda. And I would say even in the next 2 to 4 months, you're going to see some, startling announcement on deregulation and economic reform.
So give us a sense of how that would translate to in terms of investments into Indonesia and hence growth, considering as well where the rupiah is at this point in time and the outlook for the dollar is still uncertain. Everybody looking at a weaker dollar, but that could change.
Well, to give you one example, right, it's startling how closed Indonesia still is. We have twice as many sectors which are restricted to international investment compared to 10 years ago. So merely by removing some of these prohibitions on investment, you're deregulating, you're freeing up space for investment to come in. These prohibitions are really what I call step zero, right? You're just changing the sign that's hanging on your door from no entry allowed to welcome in. That's a simple thing, but in many of my conversations around the world, surprisingly, that's the number one thing people ask about.
Tom, are you concerned about a possible trade war given what Trump is doing right now, imposing tariffs on metals? Some people say, you know what, it's not that significant for the industry. Do you share that view?
I think it's potentially very significant, but Linda, let me try to be a bit naughty and take a eccentric and contrarian view, especially for an establishment technocrat like myself, right? Look, the USA is confronting a rapidly widening trade deficit, right? So I would actually say it's kind of understandable that the administration in Washington is trying to do something fast. Internal restructuring takes time, but I think, in my view, it's somewhat understandable that they're taking rapid action just to send a signal, right? But yeah, I think this potentially has deep and wide repercussions.
Do you see retaliation from the likes of China in particular?
What I would say is that the Chinese government, I think, has proven itself to be an extremely savvy, astute operator, right? So whatever it is they do, I expect it to be very astute, very wise, and very clever. And that is the world we live in these days. But look, these sorts of things tend to grab the headlines, right? There's other much more fundamental and historic things happening, like the continuing rise of hundreds of millions of people in China, India, Southeast Asia, into what we call the global middle class, right? Regional and even international tourism is booming, right? International tourism is growing at twice the rate of the global economy. And again, back to technology, right? Those are much bigger and much more significant than with no lesser respect, but so-called old line industries like steel and aluminum, right? These days we have much bigger things going on in technology, internet, and tourism and lifestyle.
I want to jump in here. You talked about China. We're seeing an acceleration of Chinese investments into Indonesia. Do you see that picking up even more?
Yes, in short.
Can you quantify that?
Well, China has gone from 5 years ago being our number 13 biggest investor in Indonesia to today being number 2 largest investor. So it's rapidly moved up the rankings to become a top investor in Indonesia. The first thing I would say is that it's a mathematical inevitability given the size of the Chinese economy, right? They're now the second largest economy in the world, and they're the largest in Asia, so it's natural that they would become a top investor in not just Indonesia, but most countries around the world. Number 2, there's so much complementarity between China and Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, right? They have a shrinking labor force. We have a young and expanding labor force, right? So labor-intensive industries most likely will migrate from China to Southeast Asia and Indonesia, for example.
All right, Tom, we have to leave it there. Tom Lembong, Indonesia's investment chief, speaking to us here in Singapore.